إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعين ونستغفره ونؤمن به توكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أما بعد. As we conclude our history of the first 100 years of Islam, I would like us to end with a discussion of who was perhaps the most righteous and the most extraordinary of the second generation of Muslim leaders. And that is Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz, rahimahullah. So over the past few weeks, we went through about 50 years of our history, starting with Karbala, then we looked at the civil war, we looked at the reign of Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. But in this period, one reign stands out as leagues above everybody else. And that is the reign of Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz. Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz was the 8th Umayyad Caliph. In the Umayyad dynasty, he was the 8th in a row. And his reign is very unique for a number of reasons. Let's start with his lineage. Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz, from his father's side, is an Umayyad. He is Umar, the son of Abdul Aziz, the son of Marwan ibn Hakam. Right? So we mentioned a few weeks ago that when Yazid died, Marwan ibn Hakam takes the Khilafah to his branch of the Umayyad family. Right? Marwan has two sons, Abdul Malik and Abdul Aziz. Abdul Malik becomes the king and the father of kings, and almost all the kings after that are from the descendants of Abdul Malik. Abdul Aziz becomes the governor of Medina and then the governor of Egypt, and he passes away during the reign of Abdul Malik, so he never becomes the Khalifa. But Abdul Malik's son Umar, he becomes the Khalifa at some point. So he is an Umayyad on his father's side. On his mother's side, Umar is the great-grandson of Umar. On his mother's side, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz is the great-grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. So there's a famous story where Umar ibn al-Khattab, one night he was out and he heard a righteous woman, arguing with her mother about something that her mother wanted her to do that was haram. And he was so amazed by this young woman's righteousness that he wanted that woman to marry his son. And so this righteous woman marries Asif, the son of Umar, and Umar radiallahu anhu has a dream that from their descendants will come a righteous king. He has a dream that from the descendants of Asif and this righteous lady will come a righteous king. So Asif and his wife have a daughter named Layla. And Layla marries the governor, the king's brother, Abdul Aziz. And so Layla and Abdul Aziz have a son who they name after his great-grandfather. They name him Umar. So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz is a man with an amazing lineage. On his father's side, he is a Umayyad. On his mother's side, he is the great-grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab. He is also linked to the Umayyad family in another way. Umar bin Abdul Aziz marries the princess, Fatima binti Abdul Malik. So Fatima is the daughter of the king. She's also the first cousin of Umar. It's normally in royal families that they marry their first cousins to keep the bloodline, secure. So she's the cousin and she's the cousin of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, and she marries him. And he has two other wives as well, but she's the one that's famous because she's part of the royal family. Fatima herself is an interesting figure in our history. Her title in the history books is Al-Amiratu Zahida, the queen who had zuhud, the queen who was righteous. She's a woman who's born into royalty, but she's a very righteous woman. Umar bin Abdul Aziz had a very different upbringing from the rest of the Umayyads. In general, the Umayyad kings and princes are brought up in the palaces of Damascus, and they are given a very royal upbringing, a very royal education. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz grows up in Medina. He grows up in Medina under the tutelage of the Sahaba. So he grows up studying with the Sahaba. You can imagine the difference. You have some Umayyad princes growing up in a palace in Damascus, and you have one growing up in Medina being taught by the Sahaba. He's obviously going to grow up to be a very different person from his cousins. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz grows up, and eventually his cousin Walid becomes the king after Abdul Malik dies, and he appoints Umar ibn Abdul Aziz as the governor of Medina. So this is Umar ibn Abdul Aziz's first a major political role. He becomes the governor of Medina. Just a little brief about Walid, King Walid. One interesting point about King Walid. The Ummah expanded the most during the reign of King Walid. So we mentioned 2 weeks ago that Abdul Malik establishes the Umayyad Empire, right? Walid expands that empire rapidly. When Walid becomes king, the Muslim world is the Middle East. When Walid dies, the Muslim world is from Spain to India. All of those lands are conquered during the reign of Walid. The Muslim Ummah grows rapidly. You now have Spain, North Africa, you have the whole of the Middle East, you have all what's today Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to the borders of India. All of these lands are now Muslim lands. So massive expansion. It's during this reign that Walid appoints Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz as the governor of Medina. As the governor, Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz excels. He is a righteous governor. People love him. He's a just governor. People love him so much that there's a mass migration from other parts of the Muslim world to Medina. And this makes the other governors jealous, right? Because people are leaving their lands to go live under Umar. And they start to argue with the king, like, this man's making us look bad. And Walid doesn't want any arguments between his governors. And he also wants to protect Umar because Umar is family. So he tells Umar to step down as governor and to move to Damascus and to work in the palace. So Umar bin Abdul Aziz, with a very heavy heart, he leaves Medina for Damascus, not realizing Allah has something greater in store for him in Damascus than what he had in Medina. Umar bin Abdul Aziz leaves Medina, he moves to Damascus, he starts to work in the palace with his cousins. Walid dies and Walid's brother Suleiman becomes the king. Now Suleiman's kingdom or his reign is like a footnote in our history. He doesn't really accomplish much, right? Compared to his brother and his father. Abdul Malik establishes this empire, Walid expands the empire. Suleiman wastes his reign in food and women, right? He's this rich, spoiled king who's just enjoying life. And because he enjoys life a bit too much, within 3 years of being king, he gets sick and he dies, right? It happens when you enjoy this world a bit too much. There's always too much of a good thing. So Suleiman, he's known for overeating, he's known for being overweight, and at a very young age he gets sick and he dies. So as he's close to his death and the doctors inform him that your time's going to be up soon, he starts to regret his life choices. And he does one good deed, one extraordinary good deed. Suleiman begins to regret his life choices. He feels like he wasted his life, he wasted his reign, he didn't do anything really good. What's he going to show to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment? So he says he's going to do one good thing before he dies. He says from all of his brothers and his cousins and his children, whoever becomes the next king, it must be someone that's going to be a blessing to this ummah. It must be the best choice possible. And so he consults the ulama, he consults his advisors, and everybody tells him, in your entire family, Umar is your best choice. If you make Umar the next king, that's your good deed. Anything Umar does, you're going to get the reward for it. And so Suleiman does just that. He writes in his will that when he dies, his cousin / brother-in-law Umar will be the next king. And so Suleiman passes away in the year 99 AH. And Umar bin Abdul Aziz only finds out after that he has been appointed as the next Khalifa, as the next king. And he doesn't want it, but when Allah puts a responsibility on someone, they do the best job that they can. It's interesting that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was only Khalifa for 2.5 years. This is extraordinary. 2.5 years. So what his reign does is, it gives us a snapshot of what this ummah could have been like if we had righteous kings. You see, it's the qadr of Allah that the majority of kings in Muslim history were average. They had good, they had bad. There were some who were tyrants, there were some who were righteous, but most of them were average, right? Umar bin Abdul Aziz was that rare light of righteous leadership. A very rare glimpse of what it is like for a righteous, scholarly man to be the king. And in his reign of just 2.5 years, he accomplished extraordinary things. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz comes into power, and the first thing he does is he makes changes in the lifestyle of the Umayyads. So one of the negatives of the Umayyad Empire was that they were they lived a very extravagant lifestyle at the expense of the ummah, right? They would in some ways throw unfair and unjust taxes, usurp the money of people, and use it to fund an extravagant lifestyle for themselves. So they lived a very extravagant lifestyle. They lived like kings. They basically wanted to emulate the Caesars of Rome in their lifestyle. And Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz comes into power and he gets rid of this. He lives a very simple life. He tries to live like Abu Bakr and Umar. Right? This is 100 years later, but he wants to live like Abu Bakr and Umar. A very simple life. And his wives and children also. Very simple life. And it's interesting because his wife Fatima is born and raised in luxury. She is the daughter of the queen, the granddaughter of the queen, the sister of the daughter of the king, the granddaughter of the king, and the sister of 4 kings. She has the most luxurious lifestyle probably anyone in history could think of having. Yet when her husband says we are going to live a simple life for the sake of Allah, she goes all into living a simple life for the sake of Allah, to such an extent that when Umar passes away and her brother Yazid comes into power, it's always the Yazids, right? Her brother Yazid comes into power, it's a different Yazid. He tells her, you can have all that money and extravagance back. And she says, I obeyed my husband when he was alive. I'm not going to disobey him after he's dead. And she continues to live a simple life for the rest of her life, even though she has access to all the treasures in the world. So they live a very, very simple life. And he forces this upon the Umayyads to simplify because this money doesn't belong to them. He also has an interesting policy where he reverses the unjust taxes that the Umayyads were charging. So again, another negative of the early Umayyads is that they would double tax the convert. What do we mean by double tax the convert? There are 2 taxes in Islam, right? The non-Muslim pays jizya, the Muslim pays zakah. The early Umayyads would double tax the convert. If somebody converted to Islam, they'd make them pay jizya plus zakah. So they get double taxed. This was discouraging people from accepting Islam, and it was unjust, it's haram, right? So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz becomes the Khalifa and he gets rid of this tax policy. He says, non-Muslims pay jizya, Muslims pay zakah. If somebody converts, they stop collecting jizya from them, only collect the zakah from them. One of his governors writes to him and says, if we do this, we're going to lose a lot of revenue. Right? We're going to lose a lot of money. Because there are thousands of converts at that time. And then Umar ibn Abdul Aziz makes an extraordinary statement. He writes back to the governor and he says, Allah did not send his messenger as a tax collector. He sent him as rahmatul lil alameen. He sent him as a mercy to this universe. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz has a few other extraordinary policies that sets him apart from those who came before and after him. From amongst them was his focus on knowledge. He increases the salaries of ulama, he gives them more freedom, and he ensures that every part of the Muslim world has ulama. Highly paid, well-trained ulama to teach the people and to do da'wah. And so knowledge spreads throughout the Muslim world in the reign of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. On top of that, he notices that Muslims have conquered a lot of land, but they are neglecting these lands. And so he does something different from anyone before or after him. He pauses the expansive jihad. Right? So part of the empire building of Muslims is that they would wage expansive jihad on the nearby regions to conquer those regions. In the reign of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, he put a pause on it. He said, let's develop these regions first because these people are being neglected. And one of the best examples of this is Spain. Spain is conquered in the reign of Walid ibn Abdul Malik, and the Umayyads pay absolutely no attention to it. It's just they basically leave it to self-govern and to self-run. And they forget about it. Spain's in Europe, they're in Damascus. Umar bin Abdul Aziz appoints a righteous man as the governor of Spain, and he gives him a very interesting project. He tells him to record in writing for him a full census of Spain. He needs to record for him who are the people of Spain, what are their demographics, what are their religions, what's the geography, what are the cities, what are the villages, what are their needs. He wants to know about this land in full details as possible so they can figure out what they can do for the people of these lands. Again, we're talking 1,300 years ago. And when you study history, this is a little pause here, side note here. When you study history, you realize the lies that other people bring, right? Because one of the lies of history is that the world was uncivilized until the Europeans brought civilization to us. But here we have 1,300 years ago, the Muslim world was very civilized. Extraordinary level of civilization. And so Umar bin Abdul Aziz begins the project of developing Spain. And within 100 years, Spain becomes a separate Umayyad superpower. Right? 100 years later, there are now two Muslim superpowers in the world. Spain, run by the Umayyads, and the rest of the Muslim world run by the Abbasids. But the development of Spain starts in the reign of Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz. From the extraordinary projects that Umar bin Abdul Aziz started was the compilation of hadith. So here he resembles his great-grandfather. Umar ibn Khattab was the one who came up with the idea that we should compile the Quran into one book so that it is preserved. 90 years later, his great-grandson comes up with a similar idea that we should compile the authentic hadith into books so that they are preserved. And so he delegates this project to some of the ulama and muhaddithin of his time, and he pays them for it. And so the project of hadith compilation begins in the reign of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. It goes on for 200 years, reaching its peak with Imam al-Bukhari 200 years later. Sadly, the reign of Umar bin Abdul Aziz is very short. His cousins can't stand his radical changes. His cousins want their money back, they want their luxuries back, they want that lavish lifestyle back. So they plot against him, and they bribe one of his slaves to poison his food. And he dies at a very young age, some say 38, some say 40, very young age, in the year 101 AH. Umar bin Abdul Aziz dies, one of his cousins goes back into power, and some of these policies are reversed, and the Umayyads go back to living their lavish lifestyle for another 20 years before the Abbasids take over. But Umar bin Abdul Aziz leaves behind a legacy of what is the model of a righteous king. What does a righteous king look like, and what can he accomplish? Imagine Umar bin Abdul Aziz accomplishes all of this in 2 years. Imagine if he had 20 years. Imagine if he had 50 years. This is really a snapshot of what a righteous leader looks like. And this is why many of the historians actually call Umar bin Abdul Aziz the fifth of the rightly guided Khalifas. When they talk about the Khulafa Rashidin, they talk about Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman and Ali, and then some say Umar bin Abdul Aziz at number 5. Because this man comes almost 100 years later, yet his level of justice and righteousness resembles that of Abu Bakr and Umar. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Alhamdulillahi wahdah. والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. I want us to reflect on a very interesting statement that the wife of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz made about him. Right? They say, you know if a man is truly pious if his wife says he's pious. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُكُمْ خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِكُمْ. The best of you are those who are best to their families. And so what is the testimony of the wife of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz? There are actually many statements from Fatima about the righteousness of her husband, but one stands out for me because when I first read it, about 15 years ago, when I first read the statement, it redefined for me what piety is, what taqwa is. So Fatima bint Abdul Malik comments on the personality of her husband Umar bin Abdul Aziz, and she says, he was not a man who used to pray too much or pray anything extraordinary. Nor was he a man who used to fast often. But by Allah, I have never met a more pious man than him. I have never seen a more pious man than him. This statement, it's extraordinary because when we think of piety, we assume it's somebody who's praying tahajjud every day. We assume it's somebody who's fasting multiple times a week. But Fatima bint Abdul Malik says that wasn't the lifestyle of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. He wasn't known for his salah or his fasting. His piety came in other ways. His piety came in his leadership. That he feared Allah in every decision he made as Khalifa. That was his piety. Just leadership was his piety. The lesson I want us to take from this statement of Fatima bint Abdul Malik is that piety comes in different forms. When it comes to the minimum, the basics, we all have to do the minimum, right? We all have to pray 5 times a day. We all have to eat halal and earn halal and cover our aura. All of this everybody has to do. But when you build upon that with extra good deeds to try and become righteous, there are different paths to righteousness. For some people it's the tahajjud. For some it's fasting. For some it's sadaqah, it's giving lots of charity. For some it's being involved in community work. For some it is da'wah. For some it is Islamic knowledge and learning and teaching the sciences of Islam. For Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz, it was just leadership. His piety was manifest in his just leadership. In the fact that every decision he made in office was made based on taqwa. Taqwa was his deciding factor in anything he did as the Khalifa. And I want to end with a hadith, or just a reflection on a hadith. We all know the hadith of the 7 people who will be under the shade of Allah's throne on the last day. And we know that these are 7 types of people that it's very difficult to get to those levels. That's why they have such a good reward. But what's the first of the 7? When the Prophet ﷺ said that 7 types of people will be under the shade of Allah's throne on the last day. What was the number 1 type of person, he said? The just king, the just ruler. Number 1 will be the just ruler. Why? Because a just ruler is so rare. It is so difficult at any point in history to find a king or a ruler of any type who is truly pious. Pious kings are rare. Umar Ibn Abdul Aziz is the model of the pious king. He is the model of what a righteous ruler looks like. Now we aren't rulers, but we can learn from your taqwa, we can learn from your justice, we can learn from this, that in whatever responsibilities we have, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in our families, that we be just and that we be righteous in the decisions that we make in all of these levels. And so, the main lesson I want us to take from this is that piety comes in different forms. Just because you find one act of worship difficult, doesn't mean you can't excel at a different act of worship. Just because you find it hard to wake up with tahajjud, doesn't mean you can't be a person of charity. Just because you find it hard to fast, doesn't mean you can't be a person of da'wah. There are different levels of piety, different types of piety. Umar bin Abdul Aziz represents one of those types of piety, and that is the piety of the just ruler. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and Fatima bint Abdul Malik. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to let us see in our lifetime righteous rulers and a return of the power and glory of Islam, and an end to the tyranny that plagues the Muslim lands and the genocides that are going on in Gaza and other lands. اللهم انصر المجاهدين في فلسطين، اللهم انصر المستضعفين في فلسطين، اللهم اعز الاسلام والمسلمين، اللهم اعز الاسلام والمسلمين، اللهم اعز الاسلام والمسلمين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، والسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين.